To most of the world, the name Vietnam brings one thing to mind: the war. Having wrested their independence from French and then Japanese colonial rule, the young Indo-Chinese countries of Kampuchea, modern Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam became a fresh battleground for the political influences of the United States and Soviet Union. Through this power struggle, Vietnam, the largest and most populous country in Indochina, faced divide. The USSR and its then ally China backed Ho Chi Minh's communist North Vietnamese government in Hanoi. Meanwhile, the United States backed a nationalist South Vietnamese government in Saigon. The stage was set for a brutal civil war that would span decades, with the direct American intervention from the late 1960s to early 70s being the conflict's most indelible memory to the wider world. Vietnam was the primary flashpoint of the great game between the superpowers, and proved a crucible through which the American people experienced something of a maturation process. This simplified account of an incredibly dense and incredibly tragic episode in global history will suffice for context to the one battle, one event, and one man that this video will focus on. In 1968, the United States had been officially militarily committed to Vietnam for 4 years, and unofficially for more than a decade. Tens of thousands of Americans and South Vietnamese had died in the jungles and swamps of Indochina, slogging through mud in unbearable tropical conditions to root out communist guerrilla fighters hiding in caves, tunnel systems, and deep forest. Most of the casualties, for the United States anyway, were caused by hidden traps and mines, rather than direct combat with the enemy. The war was one of attrition. American Commander William Westmoreland's recourse to winning this asymmetrical war was to kill more of the enemy than they could reinforce. And, for a time, that worked. Going by multiple estimates of historians and of the North Vietnamese government itself, for every American soldier killed, they took between 7 to 15 communist fighters with them. This was in large part due to American air power, but still, fighting the war on these terms was becoming untenable for the North. Hanoi realized a new strategy was needed to break the deadlock. The 31st of January 1968 was meant to be uneventful. The Tet Festival, Vietnamese New Year, had brought a ceasefire on cultural grounds, and Vietnam was expecting a day's break from the bloodshed. Instead, in the early hours of the morning, the people of the cities of South Vietnam awoke to the sounds of battle closer than they had ever heard before. Under cover of night, over many weeks, the Viet Cong, the Communist Party's guerrilla army within South Vietnam, had maneuvered through tunnels, sewer systems, and the swamps of the Mekong River Delta to mass underneath every major city and location of strategic value in South Vietnam. It was one of the greatest surprise attacks in history, and became known as the Tet Offensive. Now, not just in the rural rice paddies and jungles, but on the streets of Saigon, bloody battles were being fought, often building to building, room to room. The civilian death toll was catastrophic. Armed with lists of ideological enemies supplied by communist infiltrators within the South, the Viet Cong tore a bloody swathe through the urban population. Overnight, in homes across the country, men with guns sprang into bedrooms and executed at will. The toll on the command structure of the South Vietnamese army and government was incalculable. Amidst this chaos was a man named Nguyen Ngoc Loan. Loan was born in Hue, the ancient religious capital of Vietnam, to a middle-class family. He was one of 11 children, being the first of his family to attend university, afterwards joining an officer training school for the South Vietnamese Army. He learned to speak English after spending a period of his training in the United States, and in the early stages of the Vietnam War became a renowned pilot and wingman of the future South Vietnamese Prime Minister, Nguyen Ngoc. By the time of the Tet Offensive, Loan was a brigadier general in the South Vietnamese National Police, responsible for intelligence and security. This alone meant that the surprise nature of the Tet Offensive was something he took personally. On the 1st of February 1968, something happened that would change Luan's life and the course of the entire Vietnam War dramatically. In the early afternoon, a Viet Cong fighter named Nguyen Van Lem was taken into custody by Luan near the National Police headquarters. Lem was found wearing civilian clothes, as were most of the undercover communist fighters. He was found near a mass grave of over 30 people. Included in this number was Luan's close friend, Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Tuan, as well as Tuan's wife, 6 children, and 80-year-old mother. Their throats had been slit while they were sleeping. All caught on film, a visibly shell-shocked and exhausted Luan marches his prisoner down a street towards his jeep. Suddenly and without warning, Luan pulls his revolver, and in that exact instant, this image is captured. The photograph was taken by American journalist Eddie Adams, to whom Luan turned, holstering his gun, and said, "If you hesitate, if you don't do your duty, your men won't follow you." Within a day, the photograph was plastered across the front pages of newspapers globally. The world, however, didn't know Nguyen Ngoc Luan or Nguyen Van Lem. The image burned into the minds of the public was referred to as "Unnamed South Vietnamese officer illegally executes Viet Cong prisoner." This was a disaster for the Southern war effort. The perception of the Vietnam War back in the United States was now one of American soldiers propping up a brutal and murderous South Vietnamese regime. Though the perception the photograph helped perpetuate of South Vietnam wasn't entirely wrong, Luan became its face overnight. The Republic of South Vietnam had faced systemic issues since its inception, and the war had only strained its situation further. The divide between the mostly upper and middle-class Catholics and the majority Buddhist population was spiraling into regular riots. Also, the government had failed to offer sufficient aid to the rural populations being affected most directly by the war, and the military's policy of using farming villages as fortified forward bases to fight the Viet Cong made it increasingly unpopular. Most damning, though, was the endemic corruption, fraudulent elections, growing power of the military, and ultimately, policy being decided in Washington, D.C., and not Saigon. However, in the story of this photograph, there are 2 truths, ones which are not mutually exclusive. There are also a great many brave and noble South Vietnamese, Luan included, who genuinely fought to protect their country's independence from communism, seeing America as the lesser evil. The South gave people liberties that the North did not, and given the fact that so many hundreds of thousands fled Vietnam at the end of the war rather than submit to communist rule, it seems a reasonable conclusion that many accepted the Saigon regime as a benign alternative. It certainly was to those that were interned in communist re-education camps in the following years. The iconic photograph of Luan executing Lem captured a just man in an unjust time and situation. By the international laws of war, Luan had indeed committed a war crime. However, so had Nguyen Van Lem, a man who would largely escape scrutiny for his reprehensible actions. The photographer Eddie Adams spent months as Luan's attaché. He described at first seeing Luan as he appeared in that picture, cold and authoritative, sometimes even cruel. However, getting to know the man, Adams later admitted that he regretted capturing him in that light, and that Luan's cruelty was a product of modern Vietnam and his time. He said of the photograph, "2 lives were getting destroyed, and I was getting paid for it." When Adams said that Luan's life was destroyed by the picture, he meant it. Nobody but a small group of soldiers and himself knew the true story behind it. The brigadier general became an object of hate, even in his own country and army. He was seen as a butcher who shot defenseless prisoners. Adams had undeniably captured the spirit of the time in the war in that picture, but in doing so he had doomed Luan's reputation. When American public opinion began to turn against the war, it became an unjustifiable one on the behalf of politicians. The United States withdrew its ground troops and gradually its air support and financial aid. More than anything, without American money, South Vietnamese resistance became impossible. By 1974, communist forces had pushed south of the border, and by 1975 were threatening Saigon itself. Hundreds of thousands were evacuated by the US Navy, with Luan and his family being some of the first given his special vulnerability. On the 30th of April 1975, another famous photo was captured, of countless desperate and distraught South Vietnamese citizens attempting to board the last American helicopter out of Saigon on the roof of the US Embassy. The people of Vietnam were arguably the most exploited pawns in the great game between the powers of the Cold War. Hatred between nationalists and communists was fueled to such a degree that over the generation between the fight against the French and the Civil War, it could easily have been forgotten that both sides were Vietnamese. However, neither the tragedy of Vietnam nor the tragedy of Nguyen Ngoc ended there. Luan, like many of the thousands of exiled South Vietnamese, was settled in the United States with a generous military pension. He lived in Virginia with his wife and children for the rest of his life. However, despite using an alias, he could not escape his past. Eddie Adams felt a deep debt to Luan and shame about his treatment, and they stayed in touch for many years as friends. Initially, due to the photo and the fact that Luan's execution was technically a war crime, the US moved to deport him, asking Adams to testify against him. However, the case was dropped after Adams commended Luan's character in court. Adams devoted the rest of his life writing in papers and magazines and appearing in interviews on television, attempting to spread and explain the circumstances of the photograph and to persuade people to leave Luan alone. He also made apologies to Luan and his family for the harassment his photograph led to, but ultimately he failed in undoing the legacy of his own work. For a time, Luan made a success of his life in America, opening a restaurant. However, eventually he was forced into retirement, closing his business after repeated cases of vandalism and harassment. Adams recounted that on his last visit to Luan, he entered the restaurant's bathroom, and to his dismay discovered that the walls and cubicles were covered in profane graffiti. Particularly prominent were the words, "We know who you are." Nguyen Ngoc died in 1998, with Eddie Adams writing an emotional eulogy to his friend in Time magazine. "The guy was a hero. America should be crying. I just hate to see him go this way, without people knowing anything about him. The general killed the Viet Cong. I killed the general with my camera." Photographs are the most powerful weapon in the world. People believe them, but photographs do lie, even without manipulation. Rest in peace, Nguyen Ngoc Loan.